Chris, what are you doing back there?
I can sit back there. Yeah.
Correct. And Gerald's not coming either. But Gerald did request that we call him.
I'd rather have Wendy up here anyway.
Hey, Gerald, I'm going to put you on speaker so you can hear us. All right. And I'll mute on our end. Well, actually, I'm going to have you mute yourself, and then if you need to speak, let me know. Keep yourself muted so we don't get any background in the microphone. To a point where I'm pausing for people to ask
Are we
questions. I'll make sure
deciding that at
address
the
you as well.
next
Sorry,
meeting?
what was that?
Are we doing that at the next meeting,
Can you hear me
deciding
okay?
about all the people calling in on
Great,
Zooms?
okay.
Well, he had it on the.
Yeah, if you would just stay muted, and then I will go to
Okay,
you
I thought so.
when
Thought
we
so. I
have
have
any
no problem
questions
with it,
or
especially with his situation.
pause for questions, I should say.
Well, I mean,
And Chris, if you
there's
want
ways
a
of
handout,
doing it
there's one on the copier. They just weren't done yet.
in the way it
Okay.
had been done before was not the right way
No,
of doing it.
not at all.
Gerald, I'm going to, do you have your computer in front of you, Gerald?
Yep.
I don't have an issue with
I will share you a link to what
Yeah.
everyone else is seeing too.
trying to put a phone to a microphone.
Yeah, no, that's not
is
gonna
your-
work. It's gotta be like, we gotta be able to see it.
See, there we go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I will send you
yeah, I'm on the same page.
a copy.
I can't hear you.
Absolutely not in a closed session. though.
No, no.
All right.
No.
Yeah, there's too many risks of people being able to like log in without you knowing.
Okay, so since we technically don't have an official meeting notice, since this is a budget work session, I guess I'll take the liberty of calling it to order unless the mayor wants to do that officially. I want to thank you for taking some time to meet with all of us to begin what's the first of a series of budget work sessions. I guess I would call these abridged budget work sessions, different than has been done in the past. Not that that's a good or a bad thing. But it's sort of without some specific rules or parameters for how the discussions are being held. So, in some respects, we're sort of building it as we're flying because a budget preparation is very dynamic. Obviously, a lot of the inputs, a lot of the information that's being prepared sometimes is not readily available or immediately available when the budget or when managers submit their budget requests. So. Consider it a dynamic process that hopefully will involve some good dialogue between all of you in the room here and others that aren't necessarily, that are on the council but aren't necessarily with us tonight. So we'll want to discuss and address that probably at Monday's council meeting to set some parameters or affirm the schedule. So without further mention, we'll go into the agenda for tonight. We'll cover some formalities, review the tentative schedule that's been proposed and what departments and Wendy and I and the mayor have been working off of thus far. Review the budget compilation constraints, as I would call them. So essentially, what are some of the parameters in which we have to prepare our annual budget within? And then conclude tonight by reviewing scheduled budgets that we've got prepared for discussion and presentation. So right from the city's municipal code, here's what the municipal chapter on budget states, and I'll read it, which states, the finance director shall provide budget worksheets to all department heads by September 15th to begin the budget process for the upcoming year. This step has occurred, and you'll find out more about that next. Departmental estimates. All department heads shall present an itemized budget for the upcoming year by October 1st to the city administrator. Statements required by Wisconsin statute 62.11 section 2 shall be presented in the form prescribed by the city administrator and shall be designated as departmental estimates and shall be nearly uniform as possible for the main divisions of all departments. And then the real final formal step in the process is section 2.0508, in which the city administrator is to prepare on or before October 28th each year. The finance city administrator shall, I wonder if it's missing something there, shall prepare and submit to the council a proposed budget presenting a financial plan for conducting the affairs of the city for the ensuing calendar year. And the council shall provide a reasonable number of copies of the budget thus prepared for distribution to its citizens. So that's the formalities in which the city is operating within. There's no other prescriptions really in city code or any procedures that I was able to identify that document how this process occurs. So it's really up to us how we want to conduct it. And I think it, if there's feedback and input or questions, certainly we should be putting that stuff on the table either tonight or offline as we go forward in preparing the 2021 budget. Any comments or questions on just those basic pieces? So many of you know, and some of you might be the budget person in your family, but obviously the budget's our financial and operating plan, which matches our planned revenues and expenses with the services provided to city residents, businesses, and industries based upon our budgetary or established budgetary policies. So those that we might adopt or pass, which guide this process. In formal terms, it expresses the dollar amounts of the city's work programs for the upcoming year. And once it's adopted, this becomes a major guiding document for all of our departments for their operation and their responsibilities, functions, and activities. Many of you already know, if not everyone, that we operate on a calendar year budget, and by state law, that budget must show revenues and expenses over 3 years, plus information on debt service, fund balances, and anything else deemed appropriate. Any questions on that? So the budget timeline, as it's here, I'll move this a little closer so I can see it. So in July, budget expenditure spreadsheets were prepared by our finance director. And then once the month of June was closed out, those are those are prepared, which basically give departments a mid-year review of where the department is trending on its expenditure levels. Then in early August, leading up to the month of September here that we're in, we've distributed budget expenditure spreadsheets to all department heads and managers. They've had them since around the first week of August. In fact, I think some were sent even before that, last weekend of July. So by that deadline, and then there's a number of steps in here that are more or less inputs in the budget process that we won't spend a lot of time on because, frankly, your eyes may glaze over and we want your attention for later parts in the conversation. So second week, so since the second week of August, Wendy and I and the mayor on occasion have been meeting with department heads to review all of the requests as they stand. Again, as I referenced, these were really a point in time. Some of the departments or managers hadn't gone through the budget process before directly, so this was a first run for them, and so we wanted to spend as much time to give them to be able to prepare their request for the upcoming year. And then the end of August, we set the schedule, which our first meeting here tonight is representative of, and that is a series of budget work sessions with all of you. And then there's been a couple other dates in there around the DORs, the Department of Revenue, if you're not aware, and various parameters that the Department of Revenue sets. So that takes us through July and August. And Wendy, feel free to nudge me if you want to chime in or make any comments on any of this. So now we're into September already, and we're within the council budget presentations. The real notable one is tonight, which is the 9th, which we're preparing to talk through what we've started to talk about, which is the work session format, mayor and council's budget, the administrator's budget, clerk, finance. We're actually going to save on, hold on debt service until the end of the process because there won't be really any inputs. We can cover that, but we'll be discussing it in greater detail at a later step. The Community Development Block Grant Revolving Loan Fund for Housing and Downtown Works is tonight. And then the 16th, next Wednesday, we're planning to do the police department, the DARE program, K-9, parks, city buildings, playground and equipment, boat launch, perpetual care fund for the cemetery, Pioneer Park Historical Complex, room tax, and bike and pedestrian. And I was asked earlier, how long are these sessions expected to run? Well, depends on how much we all converse or discuss the details within them. But we are trying to balance some of them, especially some of the larger departments, public safety and public works, so that way we're not hitting all of those on one night, because that can be a lot for everyone. The 22nd, the week following, the library, fire and ambulance inspection, health and human services, hazmat tank inspection, streets, recycling, parking lot, and the Pratt budget we're anticipating to happen on that night. And on the 30th, airport, golf course, water, wastewater, stormwater, shared ride, and landfill. And I will add that the various representatives will generally be present to present these budget requests, so that way you can ask questions, talk about their objectives, hear from them as to what activities they are either going to continue or maybe discontinue if they have any of that planned for the upcoming year. So it's not just me and Wendy and whoever else speaking on these budgets. And then moving into October, we tentatively have set the 6th, so depending on how the process goes, the dental and the health plan, the TIF districts, the tax increment finance districts, the capital improvements plan, all that first week. But if the process moves quickly, we're starting, in fact, we got the dental we got the health insurance renewal information today, a preliminary estimate on that. So depending on how quickly those things come in, the sooner we'll discuss them to keep the process moving. And then looking into mid-October, when again, real more formal steps occur, and that is the 14th, where we have to publish the budget for newspaper publication, which happens, Wendy, the 25th? No, we're going to publish it on the 27th, but there's the 15-day notice that precedes the 27th in our schedule. And then again, there's some other details that come to us from the Department of Revenue when the Department of Revenue finally sets like the manufacturing valuation for the manufacturing assessed properties in the city, and then tax increment worksheets. And then November, I won't read this, but basically there's a couple of other notice requirements that'll happen in November. And then on the 9th, we're anticipating that to a specific council agenda item to adopt the municipal budget. So if you're wondering where in the process do we start making edits and changes, per the city's ordinance, I kind of glossed over this, but a formal, final, or near final draft budget as it relates from administration will be presented in late October, and that will be with the most up-to-date information we've got at that time. It'll be a balanced budget with revenues and expenses. It'll be one that hopefully we feel comfortable with, having discussed the various priorities with department heads. When I say balanced budget, there are certain to be requests that we just can't afford to accomplish next year, and it might be because we're over our expenditure restraint limitation. I'll talk about some of these things in a bit, but essentially the idea is to have like a draft budget for the public and for the council to be distributed sometime in October. But certainly by the end of the month is when we have to publish the budget. So the sooner we can get all the details, get through these meetings, the sooner we'll have a final draft of the budget. So if all goes well, I'm thinking we should be able to have something in early October, that first week, if not shortly thereafter. And I think I glossed over the city tax rate. Of course, the big thing that folks are worried about, what are my taxes going to be next year? What's the impact that the city's tax rate will have on my overall tax bill? We'll know that shortly after that budget summary is available and the administrator's budget is shared with all of you. Any other highlights in there, Wendy, that I've overlooked, or I can certainly take questions?
No, the only thing I was going to mention is we can get prepared, but there are some things that are delaying us from getting everything finalized before, like October 25th. We have a couple of late numbered notifications that come in for revenues that we have to wait for. That's why the timeline is set the way that it is.
Any other questions or comments? So once the council meets on the 9th to hold the formal budget hearing, that's when the public hearing is held to invite the public to speak before the council. Some municipalities hold it differently. I mean, there's certainly probably pros and cons to any variant, but I would say my recommendation is to hold the public hearing as close to adoption, because if you hold a public hearing and then you make a bunch of changes, it really prolongs the process to rebalance the budget should there be significant changes. So if there are priorities that you as a council member or that your constituents or the city, you've heard from residents of the city that they wish the council to consider, the sooner we can hear about those things, the better. To not wait until November 9th, certainly not the 9th of November, but even sooner. So to the extent you may even have some of these things tonight for discussion purposes, certainly would be appropriate. So one of the things you may have heard about or read about, or some of you that have been around the process a bit before, levy limits are here, and begrudgingly we all live under them, because in a lot of cases we like to believe, and without editorializing this too much, that's local government knows best, but here we are. So defined as the maximum amount a town, a city, or a village, or a county may implement as a property tax levy on parcels within their boundaries. So one of the big issues why I say I won't editorialize it is generally our costs of doing business increase at an inflationary level, right? We are all consumers of services and goods ourselves individually, so we know that costs generally don't stay the same or go down on an annual basis. So the city's net new construction rate that was just received by the city was 645 million. So that's the total amount of new construction less any reductions in the tax levy. So, for instance, if there was a major demolition of property where our tax base would have been decreased, that actually gets taken off our net new construction. So you always want to stay a step ahead of yourself, and if you're going to demolish property or reduce the tax base in any form, that your net new construction allows for a positive rate. You don't get penalized generally, but the higher the net new construction, the easier it is to prepare your budget. And so for 2021, that equates to 0.27%. So less than 0.5% of an allowable increase in our total tax levy. Now there are other intricacies here, and I won't bore you with the details, but essentially that equates to just under about $20,000 of allowable increase in our operating budget for next year as it relates to what we can levy on the property tax roll. And as we just went through in the schedule, we'll know more about what the proposed tax levy increase will be in October, but you can and so whether it's equalized value and other things, but we don't see 5-10% increases in the property tax every year because of the net levy limits. Anything on levy limits? This is the really difficult worksheet. I'm not expecting you to read it, but basically the city and Wendy has tracked the property tax rate over the course of a number of years dating back to 2011, sorry. And you can see that the property tax levy, which is around 6 million, Wendy, aside from the other numbers, that stays about the same. And it's because the net new construction in the city hasn't grown much, and therefore our expenditures couldn't have grown much alongside it without any sort of large borrowing or other qualifying expenses. So I'll pause there. Any questions or comments on levy limits? Just one of the constraints that we're preparing the budget within. Certainly something that we've shared with department heads that, if the requests come in at 5 or 10% over the previous year and we don't have a 5 or 10% revenue to offset it, aside from the property tax limitation, it's probably going to be very difficult to accomplish. So that's sort of the reality component to the budgetary process. One of the other things I thought we would walk through tonight, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it because it's somewhat it lags our reality, but it gives you a sense of where we compare in the general categories of government expenditures. And some of this you might care about, some of you may not care about this at all, but I found it very effective in looking at how the city can prioritize its spending, especially if there's areas where people have anecdotally said, well, we should spend more in this area. Well, you can kind of sense how do our peers compare. So based upon 2018 expenditure levels, there's a number of slides in here. General government gives you a sense, and I've handpicked 9 comparables. You can argue for or against probably every single one of them, whether it's population or tax base or geographic location, I mean, a number of things. So those that I've chosen on here are Merrill, Anago, Tomahawk, New London, Wapaka, Rice Lake, Toma, Shawano, and Portage. For a couple of reasons. One, population, consideration for population. One, similar geography. Two, regional comparison, if there were a county seat or not. I mean, there's a number of things, but, and I won't read through this because it's more of as a data point, right, as a benchmark for all of you as you think about what the city should spend its money on. So general government is one of the categories, and Rhinelander falls, I think, in the middle of the pack on this one here, a little bit below the middle of the pack on general government spending. Per capita, again, that's the qualifier I would say is this is on a per capita basis, so it's about the most equal and equitable, I think, way of comparing government spending. The next one is street maintenance. This one, interestingly, Rhinelander is the second from the bottom. By comparison, the city of Rice Lake had spent about twice as much as we did in 2018. And I will qualify some of this information too, because a lot of it depends on if there's a reporting methodology that might be different between places. But again, another benchmarking and data point. And the other thing with street maintenance is, we've got the Pratt and other municipalities don't necessarily have that. The Pratt was just getting stood up. We didn't necessarily have a lot of resources in the Pratt fund at that time in 2018. So I don't want to make more of this than what it should be, but it's just for your reference. Net fire and EMS. Interestingly, on this one, the city of Rhinelander spends or had spent considerably higher than the other 9 municipalities that were selected. You can see in the bottom few, it could be a matter of whether the county provides EMS in those other places than we do. For instance, in Wapaka, New London, Shawano, it's likely there's other providers in those markets, either private or county-run services or even a regional fund. So again, this is direct city spend on fire and EMS. Some other places too don't necessarily have a paid career department. They may have an paid on call or some other variant as well. Net police spend, public safety being the 2 largest expenditures. I'll just note that, but City of Rhinelander was right in the middle of the pack on net police spend in comparison, but you can tell it's really all about the same amount of spending across those municipalities. There's not a lot of variance in comparison to the previous one we just talked about. Net basic spending, don't really have anything noteworthy there. Operating expenditures, kind of all in the same pack here. Rhinelander being toward the upper third, but not considerably out of comparison. The property tax one is also an interesting one because in some places they've done things like pull their garbage off their property tax roll, and I understand the city had talked about that in the past, or other services that had been previously funded via the property tax. So again, I would qualify some of these things, but the city of Rhinelander in this comparison, in the property tax levy per capita versus the residential share is, and I've got the dot is actually the state share. I lost my I'll have to make sure I clarify that, but we lost the key on that, what the dot stood for. But when people always say, oh, the property taxes are so much higher in Rhinelander, well, when you compare it to unincorporated townships, sure. They don't have the full-time expectation generally of police and fire, library services, road maintenance, other infrastructure, nor do they provide the other services that townships generally don't provide. But when you compare it to municipalities, Rhinelander's taxes, for example, are not twice as much as they are in Antigo, for example, or take your next city, Merrill. I mean, they're all in generally the ballpark, and that's on a per capita basis. Share revenues, this is a major component of cities and counties and village and school district budgets. This is one area that I would just pause and identify too, that's something to watch for in 2021. So in 2021, the state will be preparing its next 2-year budget. And the governor has made it clear that municipalities and school districts and counties will largely be held harmless. And I think just last week, the Department of Revenue shared what income tax collections were through the end of the year. You remember IRS postponed from April 15th filing to July 15th because of the pandemic. Well, of course, the state didn't know what the actual property or income tax collections were going to be until very recently. So the good news in that is the state collected more than it was planning to collect in income taxes. So that has a material impact ultimately on what gets divvied up and sent to places like Rhinelander. But I also point this out because I find it interesting, and I didn't know this until I went through this benchmarking myself, that the city of Rhinelander, in comparison to our peers on a per capita basis, gets considerably less in shared revenue. And this has been a big argument amongst the League of Municipalities because our shared revenues per capita does not necessarily track our true costs, right? And that's why funds are like the Pratt are so important to a place like Rhinelander, because we're bearing the cost of so many other services, in this case infrastructure, in the case of the Pratt, that nobody else is paying for. But now with the Pratt, you're actually getting an equitable contribution from others that might be using that infrastructure. So, but shared revenue is a big component. So we're all still a little bit nervous about what's going to happen over the course of the coming months, or what has happened since the filing of income taxes this year, because they're not representative of what happened with the economy this year. And so when the state does its budget estimates for the next biennium budget, so the 2021-23 budget, 2 years out, it'll be interesting what happens then with collections and how, unfortunately, they'll try to make up the difference sometimes with municipalities. So some cities are preparing their 2021 budgets on a very conservative estimate, like Madison, with a 10% cut to shared revenue. And Wendy and I didn't look at what that number would be leading up to this, but I mean, that's material, that's some of our staff. I mean, we're not necessarily just cutting, professional services or whatever others might say the city spends money on, but it's likely going to be people if we have to get that far. So I'll keep moving along. Municipal debt, obviously an issue some folks care a lot about is how much is the city carrying for municipal debt. And again, it's a point in time. It's not representative of a lot of information, but it gives you a sense of where we fall on a per capita the bars, and then versus the state limit. And the state does cap our limit, and so we're borrowing. I think this would mean about 50% of the total allowed capacity than what and that's healthy. I mean, to be under 50 or around 50%. Fund balance, this is what we're carrying in reserves, also known as our rainy day fund. Fund balance per capita is a percentage of the net operating spending. See, the city of Waupaca either had a situation or a correction or something there. I'm not sure how that came out. I was kind of surprised to see that myself, that they've got a negative fund balance. But again, they may have had an audit or some certain circumstance that forced them to really take up their fund balance and show a deficit back in 2018. And the last one, individual income. I know the mayor and others have talked about this at our work sessions previously, how the city fares in comparison from a income perspective, and this is on a per-tax return, City of Rhinelander being in the second from the bottom in the amount of income that is reported to, I believe, the state per tax return. So it gives you a sense of sort of the socioeconomic status, but it again doesn't tell you a big picture about it. It's more or less a point in time. Any reflections or thoughts, surprises in any of those slides that's worth mentioning? Okay. So we'll move right into budget reviews, which I'm going to pull up those because the numbers literally were changing today as Wendy and I were going through some of those pieces together. So
Can you explain quickly even how this adds to our conversation, even with yourself and myself, with areas that we can make improvements for the future? Because as of this budget, these are the constraints we have. Constraints we have now are only limited by action or inaction that we take to make improvements. Do you want to just kind of give your own brief view of how you would look at these data points and say, okay, these are places where we can make headway? Yeah,
I think the one area was street maintenance. And again, I don't want to say that we weren't spending what we should have been spending or get into that debate, but on a comparison basis, it gives you a sense of where the priorities have been kind of up and down when you look at across the municipalities. You know, some of those obligations were reflective of collective bargaining agreements, right, with our police and fire unions. You know, so some of those numbers don't get reflected as real time, but I would say the street maintenance one was kind of an interesting one that I felt like the city of Rhinelander has, at least in looking back at the historical numbers, has invested a fair amount in street maintenance. Now, it doesn't necessarily feel like that in the surface because the surfaces are shot in some places more than others, or we've had some really tough winters and our plows have really had to do a number on them. So I was surprised to see that as in a comparison level that low. But it also gives us a sense like, okay, I mean, the numbers don't lie. We have work to do. We have priorities to set, especially in the Pratt budget where we haven't set a lot of expenditure activities. We haven't been able to because it's a new fund, but now going forward, what's our plan for that? I think the other thing that I'll mention as sort of a budgetary priority that came up in the work sessions, came up in our individual meetings with the various departments, is just the need for more planning. You know, having a one-year plan is certainly not enough. Having a 6-month plan is, you know, in some cases there hadn't been a 6-month or a year plan, so identifying a 3-year plan as a marker and ultimately a 5-year plan for replacement of our infrastructure, our fleet, our buildings, and other capital assets, it was apparent to me, it has been apparent to me there hasn't been enough energy there. And so we've begun over the course of this budget process starting to identify first with streets and underground infrastructure. Now, there's been some planning there, which is great. And the good news is we can kind of move those priorities around as the street maybe is not as nice as or is not going to last as long as we had anticipated it. But in the area of fleet replacement, I would say we're deficient. We haven't done enough planning for how much do we need to set aside for ambulance replacement? How much do we need to set aside every year for you know, squad car or for the dump truck? Or, you know, those anecdotes are just apparent across our planning. So I'm hopeful that over the course of the next 6 weeks, we're going to be able to walk out of here at least with a document. It may not be perfect, it may not have all the answers, and it may not have a funding source assigned to it, but at least identifies what are our needs so that way we can get into a conversation of identifying funding sources going forward. So, and I know, you know, the only 2 staff members are in the room, but the other staff are excited because they look at their fleet in the case of Public Works and they say, well, when are we going to finally be able to get that new plow truck? And right now, we're going to say, well, we're going to try to maybe fit it into a borrowing for next year, kind of look at those things. But until we can plan for those replacements, it's really tough to budget for them. And so we don't want to put ourselves in that situation. So we'll start with for formality's sake and format's sake. I'm going to zoom in here so folks can see this. And when Wendy prepares the worksheets, as you're seeing in this case, this is the council committees and boards, and I'm going to see how much I can zoom in here. Doesn't look like it's making it any bigger when I zoom, is it? Let's do something else here. And I don't know, Wendy, do you want to, is there anything you want to, I'm just going to hide these top rows so we can zoom in. There we go. So as departments receive their worksheets, they're essentially what you see here. Okay. Ah, there we go.
Yep, 25,000 is the first one.
Okay, just got great memory. So this is the worksheet that would essentially go to the department heads, in this case, city council, committees, and boards. The first three columns are the previous 3 years. And then as I talked about early in the process, or early in the meeting tonight, the process is to send departments that mid-year account balance, and then to do an exercise of a projected, what we're anticipating that to be. And that's what consumes a bit of the conversation. I mean, these budget meetings are about an hour plus, hour and a half in some cases for departments as they look to what they plan to spend this year and what they're actually spending and what they're projecting to spend, and then compared to their budget for the year. So in terms of format, I don't want to walk through line by line, but I do want to have some discussion about what these requests are, especially because this one is all you folks, and what you anticipate for the year. I think the one item that I would mention is sort of the discretionary spending within here. So the spending we have a little decision making about, being the legal fees. The professional services is the live stream and planning for some level of investment. We haven't gone past the first of the year discussing any engagement with our current provider or any alternatives, but we wanted to establish some budgetary level of investment for doing our live stream, since that seems to continue to be a good priority. So we assumed that we would put that in there. Legal fees, you can see the historical component to that. You'll find legal fees across the budgets. Some of it has to do with the way these budgets are funded. In the case of the utilities, you'll find legal fees because we collect utility, our rate, our budgets are supported by the rates in the respective utility accounts. And the assessor's contract, I don't remember when that expires. I haven't looked at that recently, but that would be another item that's sort of pre-committed under the current agreement. So is there any questions or comments, or maybe Wendy, is there anything you wanted to speak to on the council budget?
I just wanted to point out, like with the per diem, that is just pay to the council members for the meetings. And if you could scroll back just a little bit, you can see the difference of having the committee meetings and the council once a month to going to just council twice a month. There was a decrease in the per diem. And then, so like 2019, the actual was the 20,255. And then it's hard to do the projected because you really don't know. It's your best estimate. So the request is still going to be at 25,000, even though the actual in 2019 was only just above 20,000, just to give a little bit of a buffer for special council meetings and whatnot. But that was a nice decrease in the council budget. And on the legal fees, we had bumped that up for the next year because our plan is to start working on the bargaining agreements early. So that's just to allow for a little extra legal fee at a startup rate, and then so that it's not late. This year, it got a little bit late, so then we're doing bargaining that's backdating to January 1st of 2020. So this is just to get ahead of the game.
So legal fees that fall under, we're on mayor/council. So that 45,000 is just items that have to do with, so why wouldn't the legal fees for bargaining fall under like police and fire?
Traditionally, it's been charged here, so I just followed that methodology. And the other thing that you pay for is you're paying for the legal representation for each council member too.
So
Or
where,
not council member, I mean, at each council meeting.
Right.
To have Steve Sorensen here, we pay for his services.
under what budget does legal fees for things like public records requests fall
That's
under?
Under the clerk's budget.
That's under the clerk's
Mm-hmm.
budget.
And when we move to that, you'll see why there was an inflation in 2019.
And are we budgeting fairly high for that again this year?
No, because we're trying to be reasonable, and we still have other things we have to spend and provide through the year, where we can't just take all our money and stick it all in legal. We're gonna have to live within a budget when it comes to legal.
Absolutely.
2019 was just a very unusual year.
Yeah, yeah. That's a nice way to put it. The reason I ask is because that's really something out of the council's control. It's something that's out of the clerk's control. I mean, the records requests can come in for any reason. They can be reasonable or unreasonable. And if they're unreasonable, it can, it can lead to exorbitant legal fees, because our legal counsel has to go through every page, do they not? And redact where necessary?
It depends on the request.
Yeah, in some cases, and I think we'll want to hold that thought, because we'll want to talk about that in the clerk's budget too, knowing now where those record requests now, if it was a situation where maybe it was a request of council members, there could be a charging here. And just the way the math works out, just so everyone's like, how do you get, why 45,000, right? So it's about 13 hours a month, I believe. Sorry, no. 13 hours, where did I get that number? 1 second. I just did the math, so in case you're wondering where, because we had a worksheet of where we backed into our legal fees on this. It's essentially 163 hours a year out of the council's budget, and then, it's 13 hours a month. I want to make sure my math was right there. And I got to remember our hourly rate of $275. So that's where the math works out to be, in case you're curious, like what's the breakdown on it. So it's partially historical average. It's also thinking, okay, we have this many council meetings a month, and how did that, some confidence in the numbers, because I think we did have a considerable conversation about the legal fees, and to be able to ballpark a budget that has some predictability to it. Because state law, you can't knowingly pass a budget that you don't have confidence in. And so, of course, we wanted to do that exercise for the sake of this discussion. Wendy and I also did discuss the negotiations, police and fire, because I would have assumed they would have been charged there, or sometimes they're also charged in an HR budget for legal fees there. But because the way we're going to budget, and we'll talk about that in a second, is the admin budget contains the HR resource, 100% in the admin's budget. So in this case, it all could be lumped together as general administration, because we're not charging any utility fees or anything else to fund these things, but we are conversely charging the utilities for some of the salaries and expenses associated with the department's function. So that will cover another day. But so good question on legal fees. Other questions or discussion even on this one? Otherwise, you'll find the expenses are largely unchanged from previous years. And I may have lost our heading after I was trying to zoom in. So the next budget here, while we're on this screen, is the attorney legal services general. Again, similar discussion to what we just had, what constitutes a general legal expense. In some cases, I would think it's like the taking of property, or negotiating, an easement. It's just sort of things that come up over the course of the year. for general legal services, or it might be a matter of a constituent issue, resident issue, where we need to tap the attorney to send letters or act on our behalf in a communication. So we're budgeting, and that's kind of based on an average of at least this current year and last year, 2019, on attorney legal services. Any other comments on that one? Yes, Andrew.
Does that include the fella here in town that does like parking tickets and stuff?
That'll be contained in the police department budget. Yep. Yeah, anything that goes to like a municipal court traffic, we'll discuss those in the police budget. Now, if the city were to establish a municipal court and go through the process associated with that, then it would likely be contained in this legal budget. The next budget is the administrator's budget. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Yes, we're saving now.
All right, Mayor, talk about what's in your request for next year. No, it's just kidding. Some of this is already, set, like the salary is set before the term of the elected official. And at this point, I don't believe there's any, the one legal fees here that was set was based on somewhat of an average, and then a reshuffling of where other expenses have gone, but there's really not a lot of discretionary expenditures in this one. Anything the mayor wants to talk about there, or questions for the mayor on that budget?
Nope, I scanned the ground for pennies.
Yeah, I've seen him take his jar of pennies to the clerk's office. Though then you don't get to see that money, that actually goes to the general fund, so keep doing that. That's offsetting the cost somewhere else.
We gotta get it back up to 25%.
Yeah, right.
So I have a
Yep,
question.
please.
So like related to IT issues, is that just solely in an IT budget? I mean, or does each department have their own?
That's a good question. We'll be covering IT at a future meeting. Generally, the wages for the IT coordinator are in the IT budget, but and then same goes for capital purchases, the maintenance fees of any providers we use or subscriptions that we have for IT. Some departments do have a small IT budget depending on kind of the nature of that, and Wendy can talk about that. But yes, you'll see an IT budget separate from this.
The IT budget for City Hall is on the administrator's budget, and that was the one we were going to go to next.
Okay,
But otherwise, the other departments have their own line item budget for their IT needs.
okay.
Tara's salaries are all charged to the administrator's IT budget section. But keep in mind, we're all part of the general fund, so it's trying to break it down so that we have the expenses in the right category, but like her expenses would just be administrative anyway.
Right. I just didn't know if you wanted, like, if you broke it down by which department, like for equipment purposes or something
Yep,
like that.
we do.
If-
Correct.
If each department had their own allotment of budgeted IT equipment, or if it's all one big IT fund.
Each department has their own budget allotment for IT needs.
So then, moving into the administrator's budget, recognizing full well that some of these things we're basing off of assumptions, some of it we're not making any modifications, knowing that there hasn't been a determination on the administrator position. But the salary piece, I'll have Wendy clarify this to the extent that how that was developed, what the breakdown is for that one. Not necessarily the breakdown, but is there a percentage, did you say? There's a...
So on the salaries for the administrative budget, it's going to be 100% of the new HR position that we're hopefully going to fill within the next month and a half or so. And then the administrators, the city administrator's salary, it is, for that salary, 10% goes to water, 10% goes to wastewater, and 1% goes to each of the 6 TIF districts. So does that leave 74% is left in the administrator's budget for the general fund? There's a couple of different methodologies, but we could do where we basically like invoice the other funds of where the administrator has services to, or we could just allocate the expenses directly there. If we allocate the expenses directly to the other fund, it lowers the expense that's on the general fund, which kind of helps give us a little leverage with the expenditure restraint. So that's what the thought process was. And that was first started in the 2020 budget. And if you look at the historical 2017, 18, and 19 amounts, we weren't at full staff. So that's why those are so low.
Gerald, did I hear a question? I just heard the phone click, so I wasn't sure. Feel free to chime in because I haven't been, I think he's muted until he wants to say something. But so then obviously it's part of a calculation, and then from a accounting perspective, it's a lot easier to charge the percentages to the respective accounts versus billing the internally. It's like having IT bill PD or bill the other departments for the services. So that's, I guess, another analogy for what Wendy was just expressing there from an accounting standpoint. So again, not any modifications due to assumptions. I would recommend there's probably some discussion to be had whether or not, the car allowance and what was the other one here? Recruitment. You see the 2018 actual included $21,000 for recruitment services. I believe it was probably purely for the administrator. It wasn't for other departments where recruitment was occurring. And then various professional services. I can't.
That is MD Roffers, the zoning ordinance update.
Where the zoning code was being charged there. Was JSD, I'm trying to think if some of the JSD park planning.
JSD was all under the borrowing.
It was all under borrowing. So again, not really knowing, we can throw some amount there to assume that there's going to be some level of professional services utilized, but some of this is just a point in time, again, an assumption based upon the information we have in front of us right now.
On the MD Roffers, we did get pretty close to accurate numbers right from MD Roffers of what we'll have through the end of the year and what'll be left over to pay for in 2021.
So that will, in other words, account for what's left in that contract with them for next year. Any conversation on that particular item? Wendy referenced the hire that we've been recruiting for, which is the HR coordinator generalist. That position closed. The posting ended last Monday, and so we've begun doing some phone screens and are hopeful that we had a pretty good candidate pool that we'll be able to hopefully get that position filled soon.
It is very exciting.
Amen. I've had my fill. We sat in mechanic interviews for most of the day today. Tomorrow is another streets position. I feel like if I have done one thing around here, it's recruit, and we need to do it, but there's other things that need to be done too in the grand scheme of things. So, and I know Wendy and others that from a redundancy of providing service internally, having some backup coverage is really important, and we haven't necessarily had that for a while. Any other questions, comments on the administrator's budget? Which is the one below this one, Wendy?
That would be the IT for City Hall.
Okay, so
The next one.
there we go. I'll bring it back. There we go. We were going to look at clerk, I believe, next. It's a little too far. A little too much. So recently I sent all of you a succession planning plan or a draft component as it relates to the anticipated retirement of our clerk. And associated with that, there's some fiscal notes or fiscal comments, so you'll see those things reflected here. I'm just going to get it to a spot where we can actually see all of it. So the way the salaries is represented, there is some overlap, and part of it, it's predicated in a couple areas. One, sick leave payout, which is the amount that's anticipated to be paid out upon retirement. And then Wendy, you'll have to refresh me what the breakdown on the salaries was. We also, because we haven't posted that position or done an evaluation, one of the things we need to do is a market evaluation of the wage. So we plan to do that, and that'll ultimately be reflected in either the actual of the hiring of the clerk if it occurs during this time, or which is more likely will be what the advertised rate will be included in the salaries budget. But I'll go to Wendy on the salary breakdown on this one.
So there is an increase in the salaries. What is in there is the deputy clerk's 100% her wages, and then Val's, it's 100% full year clerk position, and then the remaining hours that Val would have as a payout for her leave banks. So there's like vacation, floating holiday, wellness days, that sort of thing. And that would be, if she were to be working those hours, it would be from January through April is basically the period of her leave banks going through. But this will allow for somebody to start right in January, and it'll cover the new person's position, plus allow payment for the leave balances to be paid out. And I highly recommend that. I do not think that that position can be vacant for any period of time.
I got a question. So for the new person in that position, is the salary, I mean, this might be the first time that this person has done a position like that. Is it going to be the same as what Val is getting paid, or how are you figuring that?
No, essentially I want to do a market review, so basically doing some level of a salary study. It wouldn't be a formal hiring somebody to do the salary study, but it would at least give us some confidence. We have that position in our pay and compensation schedule. It's budgeted at what Val's currently at, but the idea would be to advertise a range like we do all of our other recruitment. So certainly depending on experience, we have some flexibility, but no, there isn't any expectation that that person, the incumbent or incoming person would be earning that wage unless the determination was made to do so, but no expectation of that.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious.
Yep, good question. One, frankly, this is the first time we've had discussion about that plan too. So if there's other questions on kind of the overlap, you've heard staff's sort of belief, that Val's anticipated last working day, I think it was January 6th or so. And so the plan would be to 8th?
8th.
He's got, yeah.
Well, I guess I do have a question in regards to that. I'm not sure with posting for the position and hiring for that position, if we could even get somebody in by her last day. So I guess my question is, what does it look like for us come January 8th? And maybe we have somebody, maybe we don't.
Sure. So if it's the point about having somebody before her departure in this current budget year, we would address that in a budget amendment. But are you saying, if I'm understanding your question, that we may not have somebody by the time she departs?
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what our timeline looks like for advertising.
Oh, sure.
And interviewing and hiring and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the plan is to post for it in the coming weeks, at least to get the posting out there with some notification that it's anticipated the clerk would depart on the 8th, but would be available for cross-training in advance of that. So yeah, provided the candidates, we get a candidate pool, and we get someone selected, and we go through the process, the idea would be that there would be overlap, but there isn't necessarily a 2020 budget to cover significant overlap. I would say though, if we can get somebody in here for some cross-training before Val's departure. Now she's anticipated her last working day is the 8th, but she'll be on the books for about April 15th, somewhere in there. So the ability to bring someone back for some of that cross-training is something we've talked with her about. even if it's, because I think we certainly want to allow for some overlap, but at the same time, elections won't be going on, so there's only so much seasonal overlap that can occur at that time. So it's going to be limited, and then I think if there's some bringing Val back over a period of time for some limited skills assessment, making sure the person's trained in those technical areas that might be occurring, like tax collection, those things.
Okay.
And it's really, the key is, and I think in the email I sent as it relates to the plan, is a really well-documented transition document. And, we can't understate or overstate the importance of that because there's not a lot of documentation today. And that's a liability for the city to be in should something happen to our current clerk, right? Or the office in general, or heck, another pandemic that prevents someone from coming to work. So I think we need to be able to have some documentation for that office to be able to transition effectively, and then just to have going forward for the city. So that's at the core, and that's a commitment that we've got to each other to work through that on a weekly basis, where we're getting documentation in there.
Okay.
Yeah, I know the mayor's been supportive of sending, carving out her time so she can focus on some of these things, because as you can imagine, and you probably know, the clerk's office is one of those first line of defense when people are coming to City Hall.
Right.
For everything under the sun.
Yep.
We also, even with the recruiting of other positions, have implemented some of that cross-training as future definite needs, so that all information is not held in one area if it can be shared.
And an emphasis on cross-training too, right? We talked about that earlier, but we can't, again, overstate the importance of that. There's seasonally needs that ebb and flow in every department, and to the extent that we've got some staff for some backup and redundancy is just so important for a city the size of ours. Andrew, did you have something? She could apply for the position if she wanted it, but yeah, I don't, yeah, she's part of the transition succession anyway, whether it's she has a known date or an unknown date, is to really make sure that her procedures and duties are documented. We, in that email, I said we're going to review the job description. A good portion of it's accounted for there, but that's the next step before posting, and frankly, that's going to happen this week, and then we're going to get it. Once we get those edits made, we can do the salary review and then get it posted. But we don't want to post it without really a salary expectation. We've done that with some of the public works positions where we weren't really confident in the market numbers, and the candidate pool, it gets impacted when you don't have a wage out there. Does that answer your question, Andrew, on where Mary fits in? Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's an interest there, and I had understood that Mary was maybe going to retire previously, and has since reconsidered and is sticking around. So that's good from a transition standpoint, not to have to fill. I mean, that would be a really difficult transfer of knowledge, right, for everybody involved. So,
Tom.
Yeah, Tom.
Where do we stand compared to other municipalities on our pay for, like, our clerk?
That's what we need to do a review of.
Oh, that's
that
what
hasn't
we're gonna-
occurred yet. Yeah,
Okay,
part of
that-
it is really, there's probably a dozen variants of clerk positions out there, clerk treasurers, clerk HR managers, clerk, you name it. So I think it really depends on what we want that clerk to be doing. Are there things that we want that office to be doing that's not being done today? I'm not sure specifically what they could be, but there might be some. Like the city of Rice Lake, that clerk, I know her well, and she does just about everything for that city. Payroll, it's an expanded role. So I think that's an important thing, is we want to clarify that.
So there's no standard job expectations. It's all just by municipality what that clerk does?
Pretty much. I mean, there's the core of it, elections. You're not going to find many places that don't have their clerk doing elections, but some have an elections specialist, and that's what they do, and they prepare for it. Or it's seasonal, more of a temporary position. But yeah, I would say, by and large, I would say our clerk's position is not all that, it's not a major variant of what you'd see in many places. From licensing, they're doing all the licensing. So we should be able to get but in saying all that, we should be able to get a pretty solid number of what's an appropriate market level for that salary, because it's, they're not doing economic development or something that'd be kind of off the wall. They could, I mean, they very well could be. But that would be a bit more of a challenge
Okay.
to find a salary for. And I think our range for that position is also pretty appropriate. The Carlson Detman plan, that is a pretty solid number for that position in particular. Other questions on the clerk's budget? You'll see at the bottom of this, and I know we didn't go through it all, but let me just back out if I can slightly here. So we talked about the wages, overtime, sick leave payout is there, and then the associated roll-ups or benefits. But if we go down to professional services, I don't remember. Oh, that's the one. Oh, yeah. The Department of Revenue municipality fee. Okay. Weights and measures is a customary thing we've got to do to verify independently the various weights and measures in town. Legal fees, this is where it came up a bit ago. Did you have a question before that? I saw you pointing and I wasn't sure if I don't want to get too far ahead.
Yeah, I'm looking at the legal fees for 2019
Mm-hmm.
are insane. And then we're budgeting like not even a tenth of that for 2021. And I'm guessing that all had to do with, like we were talking about earlier, the open records requests. So 41,000 just for open, or not just for open record, but for the bulk of it.
But the bulk of it for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's is just uncommon. I mean, it's really astronomical in terms of when you look at other municipalities. And I think the key in this area is to have some really well-documented procedures on records, right? We've talked about records retention and records management. And part of it is, there's just so many records in different places that it's not an impossible task. It just requires a bit of focus and uninterruption and kind of the right mix of everything to manage those well. And maybe I'm too optimistic that we can reduce the open records request costs, but it all comes down to how complex they are, right? And how nuanced, and hopefully with technology and having better common places for storage of records and emails and things, it's not a daunting task to find. But you'll find that I would expect that this is a cost transfer in my mind, some to the administrator, some to IT, and then to the staff costs. Like a core competency that we'll need to incorporate in that job description is records management. And if we don't achieve that in the salary or the person, you're going to see that cost come back to legal fees. So part of it's an assumption that we're going to be able to do that cost transfer, but we may not be able to be successful.
Transparency is really important with our records and stuff, but what do other places do as far as recouping some costs for the services and finding the records? I know that there's a certain allowable charge for that, and I don't believe that we're doing that. Is that correct?
I don't know on some of the records, some of these really onerous ones or really labor-intensive ones. I can say a lot of it's predicated on a state law change, and there's been a lot of pressure from municipal leaders to change the state law to recover more of the costs. So it isn't just a 25 cent per copy, recognizing there's a lot more probably costs associated than just
Right.
25 cents a copy. The other thing to that is, on the opposite side of that discussion is the newspaper and media lobby, and who can win the legislature out on those conversations. And unfortunately, the municipalities have not been successful in trying to find a better rebalancing of that. Because I don't know when the last time open records or public record law was changed in this particular area to account for some of the fees, but it's been a while. Been a while. But maybe you can speak to cost recovery. I haven't been exposed to that.
Even that, as we attempted to do some of that this year, I believe Ben Meyer had a request just for myself and the DNR when it came to well 8 and shutting it down. It was 508 different correspondence, and then at the 25 cent fee or whatever, he said he didn't want it. So I mean, they could put in the request, we can do the work, and then they get a cost, and they don't have to pay it by that point. Well, that doesn't change the fact that I spent 3 days going through emails or anything else to find it, So that kind of recovery also still puts us at a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage because we're a local government. That's what we are. and we're meant to be transparent. I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with it when it's obtrusive to us just getting our job done.
Right.
And you will see it likely in the IT budget, but we've discussed some of the other tools that might be available to us, technologies, Laserfiche and others that can help us better index our records. I think that's the key. Fortunately, so much of our contracts and a lot of the, I'll give the city credit, there are some really good bright spots as far as I'm concerned about locating documents that I haven't even been proud to say that that's been done. So, there are some good things. It's just, there's a lot of documents and they need to get indexed and managed. And so we'll have some expense, but hopefully it'll be an initial expense. And then with the staff that are maintaining those records, getting them in a system that can be searched. Simply a Google search for records management and record identification. Yeah, Tom?
Mine said earlier. Is there I don't know how to even say it. So obviously transparency, very important. I agree completely. But is there a point to where if a certain entity is constantly asking just like random open records requests all the time, does it come to a point where it just becomes abusive?
I think the state law is pretty clear in that it's the responsibility of the government to furnish those records because they're the public trust sort of test. But I think people can argue that all day long, and it's being argued in a lot of places,
right.
Not just Rhinelander. But it's an interesting question because I think it again begs like, what's the better way, right? There's got to be a better way. I mean, I did one the other day for some invoices, and I thought to myself, as I was personally pulling all these invoices from the financial system, Wendy and I worked on it, and I just kept saying to myself, there's got to be a better way. And it could have been worse. I mean, we could have had a financial system where we didn't have easy access to all these invoices over the course of a period of time. But, I thought if I were to have to send a bill to the city for my time that the city was paying me for it, I would have been disappointed because that probably there's better uses of my time. But that's just kind of the nature of this. So we do need to find a better way. And I think the onus is on the staff and the administrator to continue to push and find that better way. And the accountability is to say, well, we've spent less in legal fees, and that's a win, because of it.
Well, maybe Chris, to save the city some money and time and all that, you should just blind copy all the media sources of all your emails.
Aha.
There you go.
There's the better way, maybe.
I'm going to tell you that one of the hardest parts of even being a non-governmental person prior to becoming the mayor is understanding the fact that the avenues by which we come to decisions, we need to have freedom in. And that's the discussion of things, the plans, the ideas, because we're going to have bad ideas, we're going to have bad plans, and when we get together to discuss them, hopefully by that time they're vetted. So all that information that leads up to the decision really somewhat is fodder until a decision's made. That being the case, like he says, using your time, we now are doing more with less. Even when we talk about the clerk's job, there's other little duties that she has aren't even listed in that because they've absorbed them over time as we decrease staffed or otherwise. Wendy puts up with that quite often, and even with the HR coming on board is finally being able to cut into some of the additional things that have been happening over a period of time that make it almost impossible to do her own job. So as we look to get to the city to full staff and then appropriate staff and then an appropriate wage, everything else, that's key. But then the same thing for myself and even Zach when it comes to our use of our time is astronomical. We could be spending it on other things that, we discussed this with our public works guy, when he got to use his time appropriately, what kind of financial difference that makes. So yeah, it is the constant struggle of then also being transparent and knowing, what's appropriate.
So I got another question. We have, talking about how to do things better, and maybe it's an IT thing. So I guess my question to Wendy and to you, Zach, would be how do we build in, or where should we build in I know you talked about borrowing, there's some stuff that we were talking about, you know, for borrowing, but if it's IT and we want to move forward with that and, you know, a whole new server and, you know, right now is the time to talk about that. So how do we build that into our budget going forward?
I believe you'll see that proposed in the IT's budget, that those expenses are there. There's been some unbundling of costs to figure out what can we maybe accomplish with some of the routes to recovery money this year. So we've been tracking our expenses and then saying, okay, if we can draw a line and say, okay, we don't anticipate any more expenses in this program, we can then accomplish other priorities, which potentially could be this routes to recovery, the way we're paying for the microphones and other things. Because in some respects, open records is very human intensive, and you can't just sit from your home or your home office in a pandemic and get those records. You got to be in a building. So there's really a direct line and argument to be made that we should be using some of that routes to recovery money to get a better document management system. So we've been just trying to unbundle the expenses, and you'll see that in the IT budget.
Okay.
Some degree of confidence with what number that is, because if we can fund it through routes to recovery, we're not borrowing for it, right? We're going to use the CARES Act money for it instead. So keep it in the back of your mind, and let's make sure we hash that when we get to that point with some detail about what's being proposed. The last thing, you know, a lot of these budgets you see tonight are wages, right? There's not a lot of discretionary spending. Well, yeah, we're going to choose that priority over this one, but when we get to some of those others, then likely there will have to be that discussion. Especially as it relates to the scope and saying, okay, what's included and what's excluded, and making sure everyone feels confident with whatever that scope is that's determined at that time. But no, you don't see any of that really in the clerk's budget, but it will be, because it's a city IT function or a city management function or a records management function. Were there other comments? I'm just going to look through. There was a couple of other notations in here. Where is it, Wendy? Maintenance agreement? No, where did we put those in IT? The new software? Yeah, okay. I was looking for it here. But we're going to be where we propose to upgrade some of the software. And again, we might be able to accomplish it through routes to recovery if it allows for resident self-service for some of our licensing, some of our IT management system in our clerk's office for beverage operator licenses and secondhand dealer licenses. It's operating off an old database. So that's an IT function. So it's contained in that budget, or will be contained when you see that budget.
I know at one of the most recent council meetings, we had discussed the new voting machines. Where do those fall?
Thank you for bringing that up. It's at the bottom here, and I was getting down there. So we got a determination further yet? Oh, under the elections. There it is.
There's a separate section for elections.
Yeah. So you'll see it here. Presently, it's still there, 15,000. But we just last week got a determination that we might be able to argue or defend a decision to fund that through routes to recovery. So it may not be a taxpayer expense locally, it'll be a federal CARES Act item. So I'll tell you, $15,000 to be able to pull off is a pretty nice item, you know, because there's not a lot of bang, right, or return for that investment, but it's necessary.
So I know we were planning on buying 2 of those machines, but if we need more and we can buy more with that money, is that something that we could still do? You know, Val said 4 machines would be ideal, but right now we were going to get 2 because that's what we can really afford.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to what do we have left to use in that grant, and we'll have some better understanding from the wages. There's some wage stuff we're going to submit for, and other expenses within public safety, I believe, was one of the items we're tracking yet. But depending on how much is left and then how much IT expenses, I think will be the point where we make the determination.
Okay.
But yeah, so again, maybe file that one, make a note of that one to further discuss it. That's also an item you can borrow for too. Not to say that we should just borrow for it, but that's a logical one because it's a capital item that's around for 5 to 10 years, I think, generally. There's some voting machines, I think, that are older than that here, which work great, but they're not cheap. Other items and then the elections, we're seeking clarification on exactly what the wages should be for elections for next year. I mean, there could be anything that pops up, but at this point, we want to get a better number. It's certainly going to be a lower volume election year than what we're currently in.
Right now, we have it set up so that it's mirroring 2017, because that had about the similar number of elections that we should be having in '21.
Okay, anything else on elections or the clerk's budget? Wendy's budget. I know you all have big questions written down for this one, right? She prepared a speech, so that's even better. Let me just back out here a little bit.
There isn't really that much to the finance budget. In the finance budget, it has 94% of my wages, and then 1% of my wages goes to each of the 6 TIF districts. It used to have 50% of the payroll specialist / administrative assistant, but we no longer have that position. And then in 2020, we moved a third of Beth's salary out of the finance budget to bill it directly to the utilities. So the utilities cover all of her salaries, because that's the majority of what she is doing. She is doing things that are required for finance, but it's based on their information. So it was a better fit to charge it directly there. The professional services, that has not changed. If you want to just scroll that way a little bit, there's notes on the side. So there's, because we have outstanding general obligation debt, we are required to do an annual disclosure. So Ellers does that for us, where they gather all the information, they send it to me, I review all the numbers, make sure I'm in agreement with what their calculations are. And then when we have to do the recycling, that's what the headwaters is. But it's the majority of the professional services just for that one-time continuing disclosure for the borrowing. The legal fees, I don't have a lot of need for legal fees because I just go to the administrator and say, we do a lot of research of our own. Then the unique thing that is a change from 2020 to 2021 is in 2020, we started the flex spending account and the HRA reimbursement for health insurance. And for 2021, the charges for diversified benefit services to manage that program for us, the expenses are going to be moved to the fund of where the revenue and the expenses are going for those 2 plans. So that's an expense that's coming off of this budget. There is, I think it's like just under $1,900. We have, it was new this year, the Health Advocate. It was supposed to be another resource to take a little workload off of the city directly for employees to go with questions and to help find the lowest cost medical care available, or to fight for their rights with the medical situations that they have. So that was new in 2020, and that's still on for 2021. We have a 3-year contract with them for that. And then the next biggest one is the audit. The majority of the audit expense gets charged to the finance department. There's a small section that gets charged to the airport and the library because they're a component unit of the city of Rhinelander. And then there's specific audit expenses that get charged directly to the utilities. If you look at the historical amounts, there's an increase to the $38,000 because once we have spent $750,000 of federal funding, once we've made the expenses, whether we collect the funding or not, then we have what's called a single audit requirement, where then they go specifically to all our grant programs and sample test the documentation for that. And with the Stevens Street project, we did spend that money in 2019 that we're paying for now with our audit in 2020, and then we'll have another one in 2021 for sure. And then we usually review that each year to see what our plans are, to see if we're gonna need it or not. But we definitely will have it for 2021.
Any other questions about the finance department's budget? Okay. Can move over to, what do we have next? Last two fairly easy ones. CDBG, this is the housing program that we talked about. I can zoom in here, give you a better sense, but essentially it's the truing up of the program, which is administered out by an outside administrator. And Wendy, I'll give you the highlights on that one, MSA on that one. But the disbursements in that, the activity that's being proposed is essentially based upon some historical average. Largely, it's dependent upon how many people take advantage or what type of activity that's in that loan. This is the 0% housing improvement loan that is most often gets paid out when the house is sold. So unless there's any activity in there, there wouldn't be any cost other than what the management of that fund entails. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to cover on that.
The only thing that I have to say on that is it's going to be impossible to project what the revenue is, but going by historical data, it's been in the 70,000 or above range. So budgeting conservatively, that's why we stuck with 50,000. And the professional services is paid directly to MSA, who manages the program for us. And that's based on how much activity, it's like a percentage of the construction disbursements. So it's like a direct relation to that. And Carrie Justman from MSA sent me some figures because it's a complete unknown. It's when does a project pop up? When can they get a contractor available to do the work? There's a lot of ifs in this, but that's going to be close to what historically happens and gives a little leeway.
David?
Yeah, I have a question about this. The last time I looked at the form on the city's website for the application for this program, it seems excessively out of date. Like at least, it's got to be at least 5 years old. And based on the names, based alone on the names of council members and such that are on there, I'm wondering if that gets updated at a regular schedule, if it needs to be updated, and when that might be, or if it's something that we just request to be looked at.
Yeah, it was recently discussed, actually, when I went to the inspections department, as we've been trying to encourage folks that we've been working with and patiently working with to make some improvements to their homes, that they consider this program. And so part two to that, I know in talking with Val, there are some, the committee's out of date. I think if there was some review on there, they may have already updated the application, the administrator of the programs, the MSA folks. And I haven't gotten or seen any updated one, but this is essentially the application you're referring to, I believe.
Yeah.
So it may have changed and it hasn't gotten updated to the
Yeah,
website.
in
But
terms of, one of the things that I was curious about was in terms of the, there are financial income restrictions, income-based restrictions and such. And I didn't know if those got updated to reflect things like cost of living adjustments over time, and or how they did. But it seems like we want to get this program utilized
right.
as much as possible, given the need in our community to have properties that need to be improved. But might have residents that don't have the funding sources to do so.
Definitely. I'd concur wholeheartedly. Val is the staff member that works with this program, her and Terry. Terry's a committee member, but we definitely can bring this to their attention. I haven't seen the application in some time, but I know it was discussed.
Zach and I discussed with Debbie Dean with WIDA that there are 3 banks in the state of Wisconsin that actually do these loaning, and one of them's right here in town is Nicolay Bank, and yet it's woefully unused.
Underutilized. But yeah, if we're sending an application with an expectation that there's certain people that are approving those applications, we want to get that clarified, and I think even the income stuff changes over time, so I don't think it has a revision date on it, but we'll follow up with that. And then, any other questions on CDBG, the revolving loan fund? I guess, Terry, when was the last time that group met to review an application? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if. Yeah, and I think we. Yeah. I know we had one payoff that we're working through on right now that might be like a short sale, but, and I talked to Carrie, I said, well, when do we market this? And she said, well, generally the clerks do it. So she was going to get us some marketing materials that they're using in other places that we could potentially do as a utility bill stuffer, or as we just talked recently, when Terry sends out a notice of, you got to do the siding, got to do the windows or the roof, that maybe we accompany that in that notification, or the clerk's office follow up with that too. So it's not necessarily coming from the enforcement agency, but it's coming from the clerk's office as a kind of a warm touch versus a heavy-handed touch. So not that, Terry's office is always heavy-handed, but, you get a letter from the inspection people, it's like, oh, darn, I gotta fix this now. But, so we're thinking about that at least, and we'll definitely follow up on the application side of things. Yeah.
We're not the city of Rhinelander anymore. We're under Oneida County, and Oneida County is part of a 5 or 7 county consortium that Langley County is actually the holder of the purse strings for. So we've never, as a committee, met and educated or found out or discussed any of that.
And I think Carrie had said that they still segregate the fund, the city and the consortium, because she had said that there was still some left in ours, which we show a fund balance at the end of the year on this. But she was going to send me, and I haven't, this has probably been over a month ago, that she was going to send me a statement that gives us a sense of, okay, what's available? Because if we're going to continue to push this program, we don't want to run it out and find ourselves, in a situation where we already know there's greater need. But I know she had said that the county fund or the consortium fund, regionalized fund, was pretty healthy, and she can always tap that for those improvements. But good mentions on that. Anything else on that CDBG? The last one we've got planned for tonight is Downtown Works. Similarly, the way the last one goes in terms of administration costs and repayments, basically it's a projected what's going to happen over the course of the year. There's some known repayment activity that is reflected in here, but otherwise, this one I know in the same vein, the application, and that the other program needs to be updated, as does the brochure, because players have changed, and frankly, the council may want to revisit the purpose, and I don't want to speak out of turn here because I don't know a ton about this program other than what I've asked and what people have told me. So, I don't know. Did you want to speak about it? No. Okay.
So I can tell you that it's a loan program where it's like up to 20,000 per loan, and it's as an interest base, so we don't know, but we've budgeted so that there's a possibility for up to 4 loans, and we haven't had any activity in 2020. So we just carried over the budget from 2020 to 2021, and the projected and the requested loan repayments and loan interests are just based on what we have as open loans of their amortization schedule of their principal and interest.
I do think, I mean, 2019, we had some good activity on there. We did some good things, so it is a good program. I'd like to keep it going strong, and I think we're short one committee member that the mayor needs to appoint yet. But we got some good members on that committee with some people from the community, and just wanted to remind the mayor of that. Fill that spot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I do have one question. How long does a business have to repay that loan? Is it 5 years?
There's, if you search, yeah, I actually pulled up the application tonight because I linked the other one.
And are there
It's
restrictions on what
5
they can use
years.
that money for?
So it's, the way that it works is they contract the improvement to their building, and we pay the contractors directly. We do
Oh.
not pay the loan applicant, and then once they reach the 20,000, they start repaying it to us.
Oh, okay, thank you.
There was a brochure that I had located, but I can't tell you where I found it, so. But that, yeah, that also needs to be reviewed and updated, as does the committee and the committee list for this other committees. I'm looking at Carrie because she brought this to my attention, and I'm sure others have discovered that too. We need to get that in the clerk's office to-do list to get those updated. It's been obviously some time since the elections, and that should be current, if not removed, if we're not going to keep it current. So, yeah, there's nothing proposed additional in the downtown works that would fund from the general fund, but these would be opportunities if you decided to capitalize or secure or apply for other resources to add to the pot. But at this point, it's just basically kind of keeping it as usual, business as usual in that. So I know someone asked me how long we're going to expect these work sessions to go, and I said an hour and a half, and we're just over an hour and a half. So that, we covered everything that we had proposed to cover, so I'm feeling good about the time slot, but if there's any questions, I'd be happy to cover them. Otherwise, as mentioned, we're planning to meet next Wednesday to discuss, these may change, but some public safety, some parks related, and a few other smaller ones as well, so. And city council on Monday, yeah. And an agenda to get ready, so hopefully we can get that out at a good time this week yet. Yeah, can you get that on the agenda?
I was just talking about that committee, or the CD, or the downtown
Downtown
works.
Works. All right, well, thanks again for your attention, and certainly if you have feedback or questions, Gerald, you're on the phone. Is there anything you've got before we adjourn?
I've been listening. Probably I'll have more questions next time.
All right, great.
So far, so good.
Okay, thank you.
It's not as easy to understand as I'd hoped, but I think I'm getting most of it.
Great, and you didn't get the worksheets today, so that'll be better to look at the numbers from that standpoint. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.